week 10's lectures on the Hound of Baskervilles. In today's session, I'm going to discuss the nature of Gothic evil. And this lecture session on this novel will draw together in the manner of a summary the key points of this particular analysis on the Hound of Baskervilles. James Mortimer, Holmes's client in The Hound of Baskervilles, is no ordinary general practitioner. Consulting the medical directory, Watson finds him to be the author of several learned essays. Is disease a reversion? Winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology, and Some Freaks of Atavism and Do We Progress, published in The Lancet and Journal of Psychology, respectively. It thus hardly seems fair for Holmes to characterize him as a mere country doctor. Mortimer's publication history is highly revealing, both about his own scientific worldview and that of the novel. Keywords in the essay's titles, Reversion, Atavism, and Progress, clearly indicate that these are investigations in evolutionary biology. In the previous lecture discussion as well, we saw how Dr. Mortimer, the doctor who hires Holmes to throw light on the mystery at Baskerville Hall, is a man who is deeply interested in pathology and in evolutionary biology. It is important for us to reinforce the notion that Mortimer's study is concerned with analyzing the nature of evolutionary biology, and the important words in his essays such as reversion, atavism, and progress are concepts which are preoccupying the minds of not only the doctors but also people in general, and this preoccupation reveals the anxieties of the society about evolution. And the question that keeps surfacing time and again is human species reverting? Are its qualities, some of its qualities, atavistic in nature? Is progression genuinely a progress towards better civilizational value? So these are some of the questions that haunt the psyche of the century when it is going to move into a different time period. The convicted murderer Selden, being sheltered on Dartmoor after his escape from Princeton by his sister and brother-in-law, is glimpsed by Watson and Sir Henry Baskerville. There was thrust out an yellow, evil face, a terrible animal face, all seemed as gored with wild passions, foul with mire, with a bristling beard, and hung with matted hair. It might well have belonged to one of those old savages who dwelt in the burrows on the hillsides. The light beneath him was reflected in his small cunning eyes, which peered fiercely to right and left through the darkness like a crafty and savage animal who has heard the steps of the hunters. This passage tells us a lot about the physical appearance of the murderer Selden, who is haunting the moors of Dartmoor. His physical description is very, very interesting because the words that detail his appearance also imply the evil nature of this particular prisoner who had escaped from the clutches of the law. Look at the choice of words used to describe this murderer Selden. Yellow is interesting. Yellow complexion suggesting not white, not perhaps belonging genuinely to the race of Great Britain. You can also notice the choice of the word animal face. Selden doesn't seem to be human. He is more animal than human. So that seems to be the indication of the choice of words used to sketch out this character. He is dirty and he is not cleaned up. He has a bristling beard, and look at the hair, which is unkempt. It's matted, and this figure, Selden, could almost be one of the primitive race of human beings. He could be he could be a savage, not part of the current civilizational society. He could as well live in the warrens and burrows on the hillsides. He could live just like the animal which hides in the hillsides, and his eyes are cunning. Look at the choice of the word again here, cunning eyes, and it is shifty as well. The eyes seem to look here and there in the darkness, and there is villainy suggested, there is savagery suggested, and he looks like an animal which is hunted by the hunters. So the important point here for us to notice is the connection between the savage nature of Selden and the point here discussed in relation to Mortimer's essays, the possibility that human beings are reverting to an earlier primitive stage, and Selden seems to be an embodiment of that kind of atavism, that kind of regression. So this novel participates in this discussion between progression and regression, and there is a Gothic subtext to the fear that human beings are going backward in time in terms of civilizational characteristics. Here is living biological proof that answers the question posed in the title of Mortimer's essay, Do We Progress? Selden is evidence of atavism, biological reversion to lower forms of life, signaled by the label of animal being applied to him twice in 3 sentences. Importantly, Watson suggests he is a reversion in time as well as in development to an age of savages and humans as hunter-gatherers. But Selden is not the only instance of biological atavism in the novel. Collectively, the various Baskervilles we meet or hear about demonstrate that immorality is genetically inherited. The villainous Stapleton is, we discover, an alias used by the son of Roger Baskerville, the black sheep of the family and scion of the old masterful Baskerville strain. Andrew Glassard points out that Selden is not just an indication. Selden is not just an indication of a reversion to the world of the savages. He is crucially a symbol of the time period in which humans lived as hunter-gatherers. So it is both a quality, the reversion is both a quality, the nature of behavior, as well as to a previous historical time period. Further, Andrew Glassard points out that this kind of reversion is not just biological reversion, there is a moral activism, an immorality also, which is an indication of this kind of reversion to the primitive state. And he points to the character of the villainous Stapleton, who is in fact the son of Roger Baskerville, and Stapleton had been suppressing his connection to the family in order to get at the property by ulterior means, and eventually it is revealed to us that he is the son of Roger Baskerville, who was the black sheep in the family, a bad character, a wastrel, and he continues that Gothic curse that we discussed. discussed in the previous session. So this quality, this morally problematic character is being passed on to the heirs of the Baskerville family, and Stapleton inherits that. This suggests that this Roger was the heir of the wild, profane, and godless Hugo Baskerville's villainy, an impression supported by the recurrence of the names Hugo and Roger in the Baskerville family line. Stapleton's true identity becomes clear to Holmes and Watson in one of the novella's most brilliant coup de theatre when they contemplate a portrait of Hugo Baskerville. Holmes conceals Hugo's hat with his arm, and Watson records his amazement. The face of Stapleton had sprung out of the canvas. Roger Baskerville is heir to Hugo Baskerville, and we know that Hugo Baskerville is the figure who originated that Gothic curse. So that villainy is a family heirloom that is being passed on from one generation to the other. And that kind of passing on of certain characteristics is reflected in terms of the choice of names such as Hugo and Roger, and this kind of passing down of these qualities, problematic moral qualities, also connects to the point about evolution in terms of civilizational characteristics. So there is a reversion going back in time to the nature of the villainous ancestor Hugo Baskerville. So that connection is something we need to remember as well. A curse doesn't merely come down, is not just handed down, it is also a mirroring of a previous age, and a mirroring of the previous ancestor. Now how do we get at the connection between Hugo Baskerville and Charles Stapleton? So here Holmes does something amazing. He performs a theatrical trick of sorts when he hides Hugo's hat with his arm, and in the absence of that particular part of the outfit, Watson immediately records his surprise because he could see the face of Stapleton emerging from the canvas. This moment echoes the spectral portraits of Gothic fiction, such as The Castle of Otranto, published in 1764, but it also offers a vivid metaphor of the past intruding on the present. Holmes explains that Stapleton is an interesting instance of a throwback, a generic reversion, but he also suggests the re-emergence of the ancient past in the modern present. Now, the element of the portrait is an important Gothic trope. Spectral portraits are also found in novels such as The Castle of Otranto, and the significations are the ones which occupy us here at this moment. Now, the portrait and the values of the figure which are present in the now, the portrait representing the past, and the contemporary figure representing the moral values of the past, are the qualities which baffles us and which also problematizes the concept of evolutionary biology, because we understand that this kind of recurrence, the re-emergence of the values of the past, is a genetic reversion as well. So the past is continuing, but also the past is re-emerging, reappearing. So there are multiple ways in which you can approach the point about this re-emergence. So the past is in the present. The past is not completely eliminated in the present. So there are multiple trajectories that are complicating the progression of time and values. The novella presents a stark and highly ideological distinction between the forces of progression in civilization and the forces of primeval disorder. The former comprises Holmes, Watson, Mortimer, and the American Sir Henry Baskerville, whose first words on seeing the gloomy ancestral home is to promise illumination from 1,000 candle power sworn Edison right here in front of the hall door. We understand from a discussion of this novel that Holmes is associated with illumination, with light, with ratiocination, with enlightenment. And in addition to Holmes, we have Watson, Mortimer, and the American figure Sir Henry Baskerville representing this domain of values and ideas. And Baskerville's words that he's going to light up the front of the hall door is symbolic in that context, because he wants to bring light where there is a greater gloom and doom. And we know that the dark moor, the setting, the isolated setting, the bleak nature of that landscape are part and parcel of the Gothic paraphernalia, which has its own set of ideas and ideologies. The domain of progress is London, with its modern hotels, art galleries, steam engines, and hansom cabs, post and messenger offices, shops selling exotic tobacco and ordnance survey maps, and newspapers carrying articles on free trade. So what is the space of progress and modernity? Modernity is represented by hotels, all these museums, engines, steam engines, and train stations, cabs, and post offices, and all these aspects of trade, selling a range of items, including survey maps that map out spaces, and newspaper articles about trade, about free trade. So these are some of the elements of progress which are present in the world of London, but which are apparently absent in the dark and Gothic atmosphere of Dartmoor. On the side of primeval disorder are Stapleton, Selden, and the Hound itself. First represented to us from the pages of the 18th century manuscript, the Hound haunts the imagination of Sir Charles Baskerville, and according to Stapleton, the inhabitants of Grimpen and its environs. Although its spectral appearance is the result of a very modern application of phosphorescent paint, that is not how it appears to Inspector Lestrade, who throws himself onto the ground in fright, or Watson for whom the spectacle conjures up primal terrors. So we have seen the domain of urbanity, modernity, light, and progress, which includes Holmes, Watson, Mortimer, and Hugo Baskerville. On the other side, in the opposite side, in the world of primeval disorder and Gothic problematics are Stapleton, the villain, Selden, the murderer, and the Hound itself, the hellhound, the Hound, which is apparently after the heirs of Baskerville Hall. Where do we first meet the Hound? We meet the Hound first on the pages of that manuscript, that 18th century manuscript. And the Hound seemed to inhabit and haunt that particular space of Grimpenmire and its surrounding areas. Now, the Hound reappears in a very modern version in it, and how does it reappear? Through the application of phosphorus, that chemical element which makes that Hound, that creature, more terrible. So the combination of legend and chemistry makes this monstrous truly abhorrent and frightening, and that's what shocks Sir Charles Baskerville into dying. So when Inspector Lestrade meets with this creature, he just can't, face that kind of appearance of that kind of creature, and he falls to the ground in fright. And even for Watson, this image of the Hound is full of primitive terrors. Never in the delirious dream of a disordered brain could anything more savage, more appalling, more hellish be conceived than that dark form and savage face which broke upon us out of the wall of fog. Again, Watson repeats a key word. The Hound is savage in more than one sense. It's a legacy, at least in the imagination of those who witness it, of an uncivilized age. The Hound, in the words of Watson, is something that is unbearable to look at. It is terribly hellish, and it's something that comes from that darkness, and its face is completely savage, and it emerges from that wall of mist and fog. And the key point here is that the repetition of the word savage is important, because the hound seems to belong to a primitive age, to a prehistoric time, and the word savage is used in the context of the murderer as well, Selden, as we just saw. So this hound is something that is passed down, just as the Gothic curse was passed down, and the reappearance is a kind of a reiteration of the past in the present, or a marking of the continuation of the past in the present, or the re-emergence of the past, taking the present to the previous world, to a previous time period. So ultimately, what we understand is that the hound represents a lack of civilization. It represents an uncivilized age, a primeval age, a prehistoric time. The domain of these forces of disorder comprises both Baskerville Hall, an ancient ivy-covered Gothic pile with somber yew-lined avenues, rafters of age-blackened oak, unlit passageways, and venerable and occasionally spectral portraits of Sir Henry's ancestors. It's another of the many versions of the House of Usher that we can find in the Holmes saga, and the moor itself, a place where the legend tells us the powers of evil are exalted during the hours of darkness. What is the nature of the hall, the Baskerville Hall? It is ancient. We know that it is a traditional household. It is a structure from the past. It is covered by ivy. In fact, Andrew Glassard calls it a Gothic pile, and it's lined with yew trees. Yew trees again symbolizing bleakness, the notion of mourning. At the same time, the hall is venerable, but it also holds the portraits of the ancestors of Sir Henry Baskerville, and the portraits are spectral, supernatural almost in tone, and we have seen how this Gothic pile, this Gothic house, is associated with other Gothic structures such as the House of Usher. Now, it's a place where we can imagine a lot of evil associated with it, just because this kind of structure is traditionally associated with the notions of darkness, bleakness, powers of evil. So this house is a classic Gothic trope. Despite Holmes's purchase of an Ordnance Survey map from Stanford's in London, the Great Grimpen Mire defies modern cartography and is perilous to any living being that tries to cross it. From a pit pony screaming as it is sucked under to Stapleton, whose confidence in knowing a safe path through the mire turns out to be misplaced when he disappears, presumably drowned at the climax of the novella. But if Baskerville Hall seems ancient to Watson, then the remnants of habitations on the moor are from a different era altogether. Holmes gets hold of a map, a government survey map, from a place called Stanford's, from a store called Stanford's in London, but this map is unable to give any kind of guidance to Holmes on the Great Grimpen Mire. In fact, this mire defies this notion of modernity. Modern cartography is at a loss on how to chart the uncharted space of Grimpen Mire, and there is a reference to a pony which is sucked under by the mire, and in fact Stapleton, who is also extremely confident that he can cross this mire, that he knows a safe passage across it, a safe path across it, even his confidence is misplaced. He finds out to his great tragedy, and he is presumed to be drowned at the climax of this novella, of this novel, The Hound of Baskerville. So if Baskerville Hall itself seems ancient to Watson. Then how can one characterize the habitations on the desolate moor? These settings seem to belong to a different time period altogether. So these are some of the aspects of the novel which captures the undefinable, the uncharted territory of the world of darkness, and perhaps even the powers of evil, or the powers that kind of offer some kind of poetic justice at the end of the narrative. As Watson reports to Holmes on the moor, you have left all traces of modern England behind you, but on the other hand, you're conscious everywhere of the homes and the work of prehistoric people. On all sides of you, as you walk, are the houses of these forgotten folk, with their graves and their huge monoliths, which are supposed to have marked their temples. As you look at the grey stone huts against the scarred hillsides, you leave your own age behind you, and if you were to see a skin-clad hairy man crawl out from a low door fitting a flint-tipped arrow onto the string of his bow, you would feel that his presence there was more natural than your own. Now, Watson is very conscious of the difference between the England, the London, in which Holmes inhabits. So that world is completely different to the world of the people one finds on the moor. Holmes and Watson have completely left behind the urban landscape, the modern world, and therefore they are very, very self-conscious about the about the landscape and its nature and its tenor, which seem to be inhabited by people who belong to the prehistoric times. Look at the choice of words that that Watson adopts to describe these people on the moor, as he calls them the forgotten folk, people who have been forgotten by the progressive modernity. In fact, their monoliths seem to be their temples, and their stone huts are part of the landscape itself. And when people look at these structures, they seem to, the people who are doing the viewing seem to be out of place, just as Holmes and Watson are. And Watson says that if you find a hairy man crawl from somewhere in the landscape, from the landscape, and use a bow and arrow, that man would seem to belong to that setting, and Holmes would be the one who is out of place. He seems to be the one who's an intruder in that region. So the novel is at pains to establish the fact that these people are the leftovers, the prehistoric sort of people, and there is a kind of a marked distinction between the people who belong with Holmes and these forgotten folk. The persistence of these ruins means that the contemporary moor remains unchanged from the place crossed by the evil Hugo and his entourage in the 17th century. Now it opened onto a broad space in which stood two of those great stones still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. After the deaths of the Hound and its owner, Holmes and Watson approach Stapleton's base of operations in the Great Grimpen Mire through a landscape more primeval than prehistoric. The larger point that is being communicated by the ideas here on the slide is that this setting, this particular landscape, this moor doesn't seem to have changed from the time of the evil Hugo Baskerville. It seems to be a constant that has completely not changed its ways. The path zigzagged from tuft to tuft of rushes among those green-scumbed pits and foul quagmires. Rank reeds and lush, slimy water plants sent an odor of decay and heavy miasmatic vapor into our faces, while a false step plunged us more than once thigh-deep into the dark, quivering mire, which shook for yards in soft undulations around our feet. So this is a fantastic description of the mire, and the mire itself seems to be an embodiment of all that is rank and evil in the psyche of the human society. So there is a lot of decay, and this decay and this quagmire is a constant. It hasn't completely gone away despite all the progression, despite all the evolution, despite all the advances in science and technology. The Great Boer War presents a contradictory picture of the Boers, both atavistic and purified by the healthy outdoor environment, and the Hound of Baskervilles provides something of a mirror image in which the British population is divided between the racially and culturally progressives associated with urban society, colonialism, and science, and regressive forces associated with superstition and savagery. Conan Doyle wrote a work on the Great Boer War, and in that work, he once again presents a distinction between the characteristics of the Boers. On the one hand, they are atavistic, they belong to a different time, a prehistoric time. On the other hand, they are pure because of their healthy outdoor life, and the same kind of idea seems to be repeated in the Hound of Baskervilles. On the one hand, we have the urban society occupied by figures such as Holmes and Watson, and in that society there are forces of colonialism and science, and they represent a progression. And on the other hand, there is the presence of superstition and savagery, which are represented by the landscape of Dartmoor. Now, the question is society progressing? The society should move forwards to greater and greater civilization. We progress, but only by defeating in war the forces of darkness in and around us, fighting for civilized values. Progress is not inevitable. It requires vigilance, disciplines, and military power, because on moors, on velds, and in deserts, there are forces from the past waiting to pull us back from the 20th century into an age of darkness. So this seems to be the greater point of Conan Doyle. There is progression, there is a move towards greater and greater civilization, but that's not a given, that's not a certainty. The forces of evil are constantly pulling the people backwards in time. So unless the forces fight in a disciplined and in a military manner everywhere, spaces such as the moors, then if the forces of progressiveness does not fight, if the forces don't fight, then the past will pull the society, the individuals back into an age of darkness. Thank you for watching. I'll continue in the next session.